Bueno, continuamos, and now it's time to start speaking English because we have with us Sommers, the CEO and founder of Fashion Revolution. You know, ¿la conocéis? Es maravillosa y es un verdadero placer. It's a great pleasure having you here. Carrie, thank you very much. Es un tremendo placer y honor presentar a esta mujer que ha provocado una revolución muy necesaria porque recordemos que la industria de la moda es la segunda industria más contaminante del mundo. Nos acompaña al mismo tiempo Oihane Aldayturriaga, eskerrik asko zuri ere benetan gurekin egoteagatik, y es la responsable de educación, talento y emprendimiento de BBK. Recordad que la sesión dura aproximadamente 20-25 minutos y a través del chat, dentro de cada sesión, podéis realizar preguntas también para Carrie, en este caso, o para Oihane. Si lo veis necesario, posteriormente tendremos un coffee break de unos 30 minutos aproximadamente y seguimos después. Recordad que el hashtag es BBSC21, podéis compartir todo lo que queréis a través de las redes sociales y estamos rodeados de voluntarias y de voluntarios para que resuelvan vuestras dudas. Vamos a hablar de esa revolución. Así que, chicas, cuando queráis, espera que están microfonando a la compañera, enseguida les damos paso. Mientras tanto, recordad que el Business Launch sigue en marcha, ese espacio que tenemos aquí justo debajo de nuestros pies, en el que también tenéis una zona de coworking en la que podéis seguir interactuando, creando redes. Si no lo habéis hecho, aprovechad y hacerlo porque desde luego que es una oportunidad única esta para interactuar, para conocer a otros emprendedores, startups, para conocer corporates, para lanzar vuestras propuestas. No tengáis vergüenza, están hablando todo el rato de lo mismo. Nuestros ponentes, todo el rato de no tener miedo al fracaso, de lanzarse, de crear una red, al fin y al cabo, de ser partícipes de este ecosistema y de demostrar también que vuestros proyectos y que vuestras ideas aportan muchísimo al ecosistema y a otros proyectos y a otras ideas. Por lo tanto, esto no es para venir, quedarse callado y escuchar, es para venir e interactuar. Y si os da mucha vergüenza, pues mi consejo es que utilicéis la aplicación para ello. ¿Están listas mis chicas? Bye. Pues adelante, Carrie Sommers eta Oihane Aldayturriaga. Fuerte aplauso para ellas.
Bueno, egun on guztioi. Good morning, everybody. I'm so glad to be here today and be lucky enough to interview Carrie Sommers, co-founder of Fashion Revolution, the world's largest fashion activism movement. You will wonder why I'm here. Well, in BBK Foundation, owners of the 57% of Kutxabank, we make the largest philanthropic activity per capita in Spain, and we are committed to transforming our society. That involves transforming fashion industry. That's why we launched an alliance with Fashion Revolution Basque Country. And for example, tomorrow we are hosting an event on textile waste. Let's see a video about this. after this amusing data, it's an honor for me to be here today with Carrie Sommers. Carrie Sommers is the founder of and Global Operations Director of Fashion Revolution, which has now become the world's largest fashion activism movement. Previously, Carrie set up her multi-award fashion brand, Pachacuti, in 1952, after a master's in Native American Studies, supporting sustainable rural livelihoods for women in the Andean region. Pachacuti pioneered radical supply chain transparency and was the world's first fair trade certified company. Carrie has won numerous awards for her work and met the Queen in recognition of her significant contribution to British business. Fashion Revolution was born out of a deep desire to demand transparency from brands, both large and small. What Carrie believes to be the first step towards systemic change within the fashion industry. I am so honored to share more of her own story today, and along with her advice for how every individual consumer can help demand change. So, Carrie, first of all, how did you get involved in the fashion industry? Welcome to Bilbao also, and how did you get involved in the fashion industry?
Thank you. Well, I was on a research trip to Ecuador in 1992 for a master's in Native American Studies, and I was really shocked at the inequitable trading patterns I saw. I mean, I actually saw the wool on the scales, that balance of that international symbol of justice, and saw the exploitation taking place, the Quechua speakers who didn't have a good level of Spanish being charged a price which just bore no resemblance to the cost per kilo, and then being made to sell their jumpers back to the middlemen for really low prices. And I would probably have gone into academia, but one day I picked up Anita Roddick's autobiography, read it from cover to cover in the garden, and decided that if one woman could make such a change in the beauty industry without any experience in that industry, then I was going to try and do something similar in fashion, at least in my summer holidays. And very quickly, after a few months, I decided that I couldn't go back and do my PhD because I could see the difference. I could see people sending their children to school for the very first time. And I named my brand Pachacuti. It means world upside down in Quechua, or the turning around of time. And it really signified my desire to redress the inequalities which I'd seen in the fashion industry. I mean, the first year wasn't easy. We're talking about, a lot about entrepreneurship here. I had 2 death threats in the first year. I had the theft of all of my business profits and a large loan from a friend's mother. I lived in a van for 9 months because I had no money, but I was determined to make a success of this. So, when you embark on your entrepreneurial journey, often it isn't easy, but, it's if you believe in the cause, if you believe in what you're doing, and, I know there's a lot of potential here from seeing the gala yesterday. There's so much that can contribute towards progress in our world. So you need a lot of grit and determination to stick with it. So I think perseverance is something I definitely learned. And Pachacuti, as you mentioned, the first company in the world to be fair trade certified by the World Fair Trade Organization. But we also took part in a 3-year European Union project called the Geo Fair Trade Project. And we traced our Panama hats back to the raw materials. We've traced them back, first of all, to each weaver's house, high up in the Andes, and then back to the raw materials in the plots in the coastal cloud forest where they're grown on community-owned plantations. And even though my husband now runs Pachacuti, my many years, sort of 20 years of working at the company, really taught me the importance of transparency and traceability in order to bring visibility to the many hidden faces and hands behind the clothes and accessories which we wear every day. And I thought at the time, if a micro brand like Pachacuti could trace their supply chain back to the raw materials, what was stopping these big brands from doing the same thing? But there seemed to be very little interest in transparency or traceability at that time.
Wow, that's interesting. You know, how crazy an entrepreneurship experience, right, can change yourself. And I guess we have a lot of examples of that here today. So how did fashion revolution come about? Because you talk about your experience with Pachacuti, so how did fashion revolution come about?
Yes, I mean, I have to admit here that actually when the Rana Plaza collapsed, I mean, I was down in London with People Tree, a company I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with when it comes to fair trade fashion. And we watched with horror at this building collapse because we'd been warning for many years that a disaster of this scale could happen. And, you know, 2,500 people were injured, 1,300 people died on that day. And it was just clear that this was where the race to the bottom had led us. These were workers in unsafe, illegally constructed buildings, workers who were afraid to enter the workplace because there was visible cracks, but they were even more afraid not to go to work because they would lose their wages or their jobs if they refused to go in. And in the days following the disaster, we saw campaigners searching through the rubble to prove which brands were producing there. And like I said, you know, my feelings at the time were almost one of like, well, finally people will realise why I've been banging on about transparency for all of these years. I certainly wasn't thinking of doing anything about it. And then one Sunday night, it was like 3 days after the collapse, I made the mistake of having a warm bath with nothing to think about. And the idea of fashion revolution almost came into my head like a fully formed idea. It was the name Fashion Revolution, the idea of doing something on the anniversary. And it seemed like a good enough idea to get out of my bath and do something about it. I think if I'd have carried on having my bath, fashion revolution would never have happened. But I think when you're an entrepreneur, you know an idea, you know when that spark of inspiration hits. So I got out of the bath and I called Ursula de Castro. And I guess, you know, the rest is kind of history. It grew, snowballed really quickly. People saying, well, can we have fashion revolution in Spain and in America and in Latin America? And it grew, now the world's largest fashion activism movement in some sort of 90 countries around the world. And 8 years on, a fashion revolution, you know, is still really needed. We're seeing, you know, the struggle for fair pay, for human dignity in supply chains. We know that some of the most severe and exploitative working conditions occur really deep down in the supply chain. So although we've seen progress at factory level, particularly in Bangladesh, our Out of Sight report we published last year showed that only one of 62 companies we surveyed was mapping its entire supply chain down to the raw materials. I believe the next edition is coming out in the next 2 weeks, and I can't give away the results, but I think it's fair to say there hasn't been that much progress. And major brands really have a clear responsibility to map and trace their environmental and their social impacts and the impact on human rights across their supply chain.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's interesting. From Rana Plaza to this worldwide movement in more than 90 countries. So why do we need a fashion revolution, Carrie?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many different reasons. I mean, obviously, you know, here we're talking a lot about climate. I mean, obviously, we just cannot continue to extract these dwindling resources from an already stressed natural world and to pollute our land, you know, and our oceans as well. So I'm going to be talking a little bit more about that. But I think what I'd like to talk about is I guess some of the most important stages that we see in terms of creating that fashion revolution so that we stop those brands sidestepping their responsibility and operating opaquely. And for fashion revolution, really this all starts with transparency. We believe that transparency leads to greater accountability, and this will eventually lead to a change in the way in which the industry works. So in July this year, we published, I can't believe it's the 6th edition already, of our Fashion Transparency Index. And we produced this index to try and compare the levels of transparency across 250 of the world's biggest fashion brands, and to incentivize brands to push them to disclose more information year on year, because brands are actually quite competitive. They want to do better than their peers. And we also wanted to inform our understanding of what good transparency looks like. And this information disclosed needs to be sufficiently granular for workers on the ground, for unions, for collective bargaining organisations to act on. And transparent disclosure makes it easier for everyone to understand what's gone wrong, who is responsible, and how to fix it. But as you can see here, 23% overall average score. Progress on transparency is clearly far too slow. And as we've seen in the face of the pandemic, we know that responsible purchasing practices go hand in hand with the ability of suppliers to pay their workers. And yet, in the face of this economic catastrophe, facing some of the world's most vulnerable workers in the fashion industry, many of the fashion brands have evaded responsibility in much the same ways that they did following the Rana Plaza collapse. So we found that brands disclose really shockingly little about their purchasing practices. Only 2 out of 250 brands disclose the number of workers who are paid a living wage. 2 out of 250 brands. And obviously, as we saw in that video, it's an urgent necessity for people in supply chains who are paid, as we saw, a quarter of the cost of supporting their family. And the pandemic has also focused on, it's sort of shone a spotlight on overproduction and overconsumption as well. We saw clothing piling up in the warehouses. And we wonder what will happen to all of those clothes, because only 14% of brands disclose any data on the amount of products that they make annually. And as you can see, the ones that do disclose really staggering quantities. It's important to say that transparency is a means to change. It's not the end game. And ultimately, the whole fashion industry will need to be transformed. So transparency is just one step to help us get there. It helps to reveal those structures which are in place so that we can better understand how to change them. And then I think, the next really important stage in the fashion revolution is legislation. I was at COP in Glasgow a few weeks ago and having meetings with MPs, MEPs, and really at an international level, a national level, and a local level, we need legislation which holds companies to account for their environmental, their human rights abuses throughout the entire supply chain. And when brands fail, there has to be meaningful sanctions as well. And we know that a lot of companies will not act unless they are required to by law. In the UK, we have the Modern Slavery Act, and even though it hasn't been really impactful at rooting out modern slavery, forced labour, some of the terrible conditions like I witnessed in the tanneries in Bangladesh, what it has done is it has forced companies to start to disclose that information, which is really important, but so much more needs to be done. One of the things that we focused on at COP as well is the link between the human rights impact of our clothing and the increasing amount of migration which we're seeing, because these are some of the most vulnerable people, as you've seen. And if you look on the Fashion Revolution website on our blog, I think it was about 2 days ago, we have published a map of the number of garment factories in Bangladesh which will be underwater by the year 2030. So that's really worth looking at it. It came out after I'd got the presentation ready, so unfortunately I haven't got a slide of it. But we really need to see more provision for these people who are going to be affected by the climate crisis. And to do this, we need legislators to really take bold and unpopular action as well. One thing that it's important to mention as well, one forthcoming campaign Fashion Revolution will be launching in April, is a European citizens initiative on a living wage for garment workers. We need to collect 1 million signatures across 7 EU countries. So I will certainly make sure that Fashion Revolution Spain is sharing that with all of you, so you can put your signatures to that and make sure that this gets debated at the highest levels in the European Union. And we're talking a lot in this forum about the climate crisis. And when it comes to the industry, we really need to look at the raw materials. I noticed one of the statistics in the video was that 150 million trees are logged annually to make viscose for our clothes, which was the statistic we were using this year. I then discovered that is already out of date. It's now 200 million trees a year. And a shocking 35 to 40% of those trees come from old growth forests. And we know that cutting down those trees increases the risk of transmission of diseases like this pandemic from wild animals to domestic animals to humans as well. So we need to ensure that these forest-based fibres are truly sustainable. And I guess this takes me back again to my entrepreneurship journey with Patrick. And my experience with Carlidovka palmata sets a really high benchmark. So these plants are grown with no destruction of the primary forest, no irrigation, no watering. And once the plants reach maturity after 2 to 3 years, they can be cropped once a month for 100 years. And we're still using plants which are 90 years old. And one of our Panama hats uses the equivalent of 13 days drinking water to produce, while a cotton hat takes the equivalent of 825 days drinking water. And this difference, is really important. Having this knowledge matters because it impacted the choices we made about how to produce our products. And the industry's fibre choices are also hugely damaging to the marine environment. And this is something I saw in January, February, through to March last year, just as the pandemic was hitting, when I was sailing from the Galapagos to Easter Island, and I sailed through the Pacific Gyre. And the water looked blue, pristine. You couldn't have seen a more calm and perfectly clear sea. And every time we put in our manta trawl, our Niskin bottle, and pulled it out, there was 20, 25, 30 different microfibers going through our sieves. And these were just the ones that we could see. I mean, there's going to be hundreds more which need to be picked up in the laboratory, and that work is ongoing at the moment. And the textile industry is the main source of primary and secondary microfibers, microplastics. It accounts for about 35% of the total. And considering this statistic, I would really have hoped to see greater action from the industry. But only about a quarter of the biggest fashion brands and retailers have any targets for reducing the amount of textiles made from virgin plastics. And only 21% report any steps to address microfiber shedding. So, it's really clear that 8 years on, even though there has been considerable progress, even though factories are safer, there is so much more to be done. And we need the industry to become much more serious about improving human rights and the environmental impact to make sure that the profits of shareholders isn't prioritised over the health and well-being of ecosystems, communities, and our own bodies, because all of us, microfiber masks, we are breathing in microfibers every day at the moment, and that is affecting our health and our fertility. It's, the ongoing impacts from this pandemic, we have yet to see them in terms of the impact of those microfibers on our body.
Well, that was, a great sum up of the main issues of the fashion industry. We would say transparency, the need of legislation, the need to focus also on raw materials and how they are produced, and the need to, to think in a holistic way of the whole supply chain. So, we have a lot to do, but thanks to organizations like yours, we are working. So you talk about your trip in Galapagos and how you collected microfibers. What do you think about fashion industry and sustainability? Can fashion industry revolutionize sustainability?
Well, I believe it can, or I wouldn't be doing this work now. But, the fashion industry covers so many different aspects, from agriculture, shipping. It's such a vast industry, and there's still a high degree of opacity. And it's not just in the supply chain until it gets to our wardrobe, it's also in terms of our use, our disposal of the garments. And if we are to revolutionise sustainability, we really need all of the stakeholders, and that includes not just the stakeholders in the supply chain, that includes us, it includes those invisible stakeholders like the ocean. I know that there's legislation which I'm working on with Marie Toussaint in France, the MEP at the moment, to try and bring in rights of nature legislation across the EU. And all of us need to try and work together to solve some of these major challenges facing the industry. And one of the things I learnt when I was on my sailing voyage, when I sailed through the South Pacific Gyre, one of the ocean currents that orbits the gyre is named after the pioneering explorer Alexander von Humboldt. And he had a really multidisciplinary approach to his science, even though they didn't call it science then. So art history, politics, poetry, philosophy, all of these were encompassed in his scientific approach. And his observations were tested as much by his body and spirit as by his mind. And his feelings were as important to his worldview as the empirical evidence that he was collecting. And Humboldt was the first person to really link colonialism with the destruction of the environment. He looked at the destruction of indigo, and he said that the earth was being exploited like a mine. And he said everything is connected. If one thread is pulled, everything around us can unravel. And when we look at the complex, multi-layered global development issues which surround our clothes, I believe that we really need to find a transdisciplinary approach. And that's where forums like this are so important. I think there's so many people coming from different sectors, but all with that same commitment to solve some of those knotty issues which need to be addressed. So we really need, we need a new social contract, which takes much more of a holistic and a collaborative and a transdisciplinary approach. And because we are more powerful voices for change when we all work together.
Yeah, for sure. We need that social contract. Today we have with us a lot of entrepreneurs. So I wanted to ask you, do you think there are business opportunities in the fashion industry?
Yes, I think there are, and I think the exciting thing for people here is that there is also now funding for those opportunities. We're starting to see more and more organisations. I don't know if you're eligible from Spain, but the John Lewis has just announced I'm not sure how much, but quite a large fund to support innovation. You have the H&M Prize in innovation. So there is a lot of potential to actually get some money to put these innovations into practice and to scale them up from the laboratory. And one of the winners, I think it was last year, were my friends Gali in Brazil. And then this is one of the most exciting innovations I've come across. I met them at a party in New York a couple of years ago, literally cornered them in the corner of the room. I wouldn't let them go until I found out all about this innovation. And I couldn't talk about it until earlier this year. But they have pioneered lab-grown cotton. So this is cotton which could be grown in a laboratory anywhere in the world, so it can be grown right next to where it's being woven, to where the clothes are being made, and there's a 90% reduction in the water use. No chemicals are needed. They can use organic cotton. They can use some of those rare breed indigenous varieties of cotton from Peru and Mexico. So this is the kind of really exciting innovation, and they've been able to scale up because of some of the prizes which they've won. Anyone interested in technologies in textiles, I would really recommend that you listen to one of the most recent episodes of The Wardrobe Crisis with the one with Cindy Rhodes, where she is talking about her experience with Worn Again and her fibre-to-fibre textile recycling. It's really excellent. And also I recommend looking at Fashion Open Studio, which is Fashion Revolution's platform which profiles pioneering designers working in so many different ways across the industry, really innovative ways. So these are the real trailblazers in the industry, and we have a separate website for Fashion Open Studio.
Well, that's nice to hear. So, all of the people, we are here. What can we do to contribute to fashion revolution and a more sustainable industry? What can we do, each of us?
Well, all of us, I mean, to change the culture of fashion, to change the industry, we have to change the culture that it thrives on, and we're all part of that. I mean, all of us as citizens have become somehow out of step with the natural world. We've felt that over the last year or two, and we need to shift the way in which we engage with our clothes. And this is why Fashion Revolution works to break the process down into stages to enable citizens to take meaningful action, like asking the brands, ¿Quién hizo mi ropa? ¿Qué hay en mi ropa? Who made my clothes? To use your voice and your power to bring about change in the shops, online. As individuals, all of us can make those choices. We can choose our fabrics wisely. We can swap our clothes. We can buy second-hand. We can learn how to wash and care for our clothes to make them last longer. And all of us can use our voice and our power wherever we like to shop, because all of us help to reshape the fashion industry. Every time we ask the question, who made my clothes, we're demanding an industry which is free from modern slavery, from child labour, and from all forms of exploitation. And when we're asking that question, what's in my clothes, we're telling brands that we don't want them to use materials which generate massive environmental impacts and which leak microfibres, microplastics into our oceans, which damage human health and nature's ecosystems. So our aim at Fashion Revolution is to mobilise people and communities across the world to speak up, to come together and to take action, and to create that systemic change which is so urgently needed, because all of us can use our voice and our power to create change. I am not Fashion Revolution. I might be the founder, but you are all Fashion Revolution in this room, and you will make change happen.
Wow, so a big applause for Carrie. Thank you, Carrie. Thanks for coming to the Basque Country. And ladies and gentlemen, Carrie Sommers, founder of Fashion Revolution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, girls.